There is a single body of water in the American desert whose fate is tied to the lives of tens of millions of people, and it is shrinking. When it finally falls too far, the blow will not land everywhere at once. Instead, it will strike like a shockwave, hitting some cities hard and early while others feel it only later. And the order in which that blow lands is one of the most important and least understood stories in America. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, the great store of the Colorado River, has been dropping for years, its water level sinking toward thresholds that would cripple the system that sustains a civilization built in the desert. And if Lake Mead were to run dry, to fall so low that it could no longer deliver its water, some cities would be hit first, before the others, because of where they sit, how they draw their water, and where they stand in the brutal hierarchy of who gets cut first. This is the story of those cities, the 10 that would be hit first if Lake Mead runs dry. Before we go on, do something for me. As we go, watch for your city on this list, and if you live anywhere in the Southwest, drop its name in the comments right now, because I promise you will want to know where it lands. And one quick, important thing. A huge number of people watch these videos, learn something that could genuinely matter for their family, and then forget to hit subscribe. If that is you, take 1 second now, because water is not a topic you want to fall behind on, and this channel is how you stay ahead of it. Subscribing is free, it takes a second, and it keeps you informed. Now, let's begin. To understand why some cities lose their water first, you have to understand what Lake Mead actually is, and how the water reaches the cities. Lake Mead is a reservoir, an enormous artificial lake created by damming the Colorado River, storing the river's water so that it can be delivered reliably to the region. The Colorado River is the lifeline of the desert Southwest, a single river that sustains tens of millions of people across multiple states, and Lake Mead is the great bank account where its water is stored before it is distributed. From the reservoir, the water flows out to the cities and farms of the region, carried through a network of intakes and canals and pipelines. Distributed according to a complex web of laws and agreements that determine who gets how much and in what order. The level of Lake Mead is, in a very real sense, the gauge that measures the health of this entire system, and as it has fallen, the danger to the cities that depend on it has grown. When we speak of Lake Mead dying, we mean the reservoir falling to the point where it can no longer function, where the water drops so low that it cannot be drawn out and delivered. The level sometimes called dead pool, below which the water is effectively trapped and the system fails. Long before that ultimate point, the falling reservoir causes escalating problems, cutting the water available to the users, threatening the power generated at the dam, and forcing ever deeper reductions in the supply. But the scenario of Lake Mead dying is the ultimate expression of the crisis, the point at which the great reservoir can no longer sustain the cities that depend on it, and it is this scenario that reveals which cities are most vulnerable, which would lose their water first. The reason some cities lose their water before others comes down to a combination of factors, and understanding them is the key to the whole story. The first factor is physical dependence, how completely a city relies on Lake Mead and the Colorado River for its water, whether it has other sources to fall back on or depends almost entirely on the reservoir. A city that draws nearly all its water from Lake Mead is far more vulnerable than one that has multiple sources. The second factor is the hierarchy of water rights, the legal system of priority that determines whose water is cut first when the supply falls short. Some users hold senior rights that are protected, while others hold junior rights that are the first to be reduced. And the third factor is the physical infrastructure, the intakes and the systems that draw the water from the reservoir, and how they are affected as the level falls. Together, these factors determine which cities would lose their water first. And it is by these measures that we can rank the 10 most vulnerable. Quick one before the countdown. As I go through these 10 cities, I want you to tell me in the comments which one surprises you the most, because a couple of these are not the cities most people expect. Your guesses and your local knowledge make these videos better for everyone watching. Let us begin the countdown of the 10 cities that would be hit first if Lake Mead runs dry, starting with those most immediately at risk. And to make sense of the ranking, remember the three factors: physical dependence, the hierarchy of rights, and the infrastructure, because each city's place reflects some combination of these. At the very top of the list, the city most immediately and completely dependent on Lake Mead is Las Vegas, Nevada. No major city in the entire system is more directly tied to the fate of the reservoir than Las Vegas, because the Las Vegas metropolitan area draws the overwhelming majority of its water directly from Lake Mead. This is the crucial fact that places Las Vegas at the very top of the list of vulnerability. While other cities have alternative sources of water to fall back on, Las Vegas depends on Lake Mead for almost all of its supply, drawing its water directly from the reservoir through intakes that reach into the lake. This near-total dependence means that Las Vegas is uniquely exposed to the fate of Lake Mead, more than almost any other city, because if the reservoir dies, the city loses the source of nearly all its water, with little to fall back on. The vulnerability of Las Vegas is compounded by the way it draws its water, through intakes positioned in the reservoir, which must reach below the surface of the water to draw it out. As the reservoir falls, these intakes are threatened, because if the water drops below the level of an intake, that intake can no longer draw water. Las Vegas has taken extraordinary measures to protect its supply, including building a very deep intake designed to continue drawing water even at very low reservoir levels. A kind of last straw positioned near the bottom of the reservoir. This engineering has given Las Vegas a way to keep drawing water even as the reservoir falls to dangerous lows, extending its ability to access the water further than it otherwise could. But even this deep intake has its limits, and if Lake Mead were to fall to the level of Dead Pool, even the deepest intake would eventually be unable to draw water, and Las Vegas would face the loss of its primary supply. The situation of Las Vegas illustrates both the extreme vulnerability of a city almost wholly dependent on a single reservoir and the lengths to which such a city must go to protect itself. Las Vegas has also become a leader in water conservation, working aggressively to reduce its water use, to recycle water, and to stretch its limited supply as far as possible, precisely because it understands its vulnerability. These efforts have allowed the city to grow while holding its water use in check, and they are a crucial part of how Las Vegas manages its exposure to the fate of Lake Mead. But no amount of conservation can replace the water entirely if the reservoir dies, and so Las Vegas remains, by virtue of its near-total dependence on Lake Mead, the city that would be most immediately and severely affected if the great reservoir were to fail. It is, without question, first on the list. Let me pause for just a moment, because this next part matters. If you have family or friends living anywhere in the cities we are covering, this is exactly the kind of thing they need to see. So take a second to share this video with them. And if this is already teaching you something useful, tap the like button, because it genuinely helps this information reach more of the people whose water is on the line. Alright, back to the countdown. Second on the list is Henderson, Nevada, a major city in the Las Vegas metropolitan area that shares in the same profound dependence on Lake Mead. Henderson, as part of the greater Las Vegas region, draws its water from the same source, from Lake Mead through the same regional system, and it shares in the same extreme vulnerability that comes from depending so heavily on a single reservoir. As one of the largest cities in Nevada and a significant population center in its own right, Henderson represents a large number of people whose water is tied to the fate of Lake Mead, and if the reservoir were to die, Henderson would face the same loss of its primary supply as the rest of the Las Vegas area. Its place near the top of the list reflects the same near-total dependence on Lake Mead that makes the entire Las Vegas region so uniquely exposed to the reservoir's decline. The vulnerability of Henderson underscores an important point, that the danger is not confined to a single city, but extends across the entire metropolitan area that depends on the same source. The greater Las Vegas region, including Henderson and the other communities of the area, is home to a large and growing population, all of it dependent on Lake Mead for the bulk of its water, and all of it exposed to the same danger. When we say that Las Vegas would lose its water first, we are really speaking of this whole region, the millions of people spread across the metropolitan area who share in the dependence on the reservoir. Henderson is a major part of that region, and its inclusion near the top of the list reflects the reality that the vulnerability extends across the entire area, encompassing a large population all tied to the fate of the same shrinking lake. Third on the list is North Las Vegas, Nevada, another significant city of the Las Vegas metropolitan area, sharing once again in the region's deep dependence on Lake Mead. Like Henderson, North Las Vegas draws its water from the same regional system fed by the reservoir, and it faces the same vulnerability that comes from that dependence. As a substantial city in its own right, part of the sprawling Las Vegas region, North Las Vegas represents another large group of people whose water supply is tied to the fate of the Great Reservoir. Its place on the list reflects the same fundamental reality that defines the vulnerability of the entire Las Vegas area, the near-total reliance on Lake Mead, which makes these cities the most immediately exposed to the reservoir's death. The presence of three cities of the Las Vegas metropolitan area at the top of the list, Las Vegas, Henderson, and North Las Vegas, tells the essential story of the region's vulnerability. This is a metropolitan area of millions of people built in the desert, dependent almost entirely on a single reservoir for its water, with limited alternatives to fall back on. No other major population center in the system is so completely tied to the fate of Lake Mead, and this is why the Las Vegas region dominates the top of the list of cities that would lose their water first. The extraordinary dependence of this desert metropolis on the reservoir is the defining fact of its water situation, and it is what places these three cities at the front of the line to lose their water if Lake Mead dies. Moving down the list, we come to the cities of Arizona, which face a different but also severe form of vulnerability, one rooted less in physical dependence on Lake Mead alone, and more in the harsh hierarchy of water rights. Fourth on the list is Phoenix, Arizona, one of the largest cities in the entire region and a major population center that draws a significant portion of its water from the Colorado River system. Phoenix is vulnerable not primarily because it draws directly from Lake Mead, but because of the junior position that Arizona holds in the priority hierarchy for the Colorado River water. Much of the water that Phoenix and central Arizona receive from the river comes through a great canal project that carries the water across the desert, and this project holds a junior priority, meaning that its water is among the first to be cut when the supply falls short. This junior priority is the crucial factor that places Phoenix high on the list of cities that would lose their water first. Because of a bargain made decades ago, Arizona accepted that the water delivered through its Great Canal project would be cut before the water of some other users, particularly California, in times of shortage. As the Colorado River crisis has deepened and the cuts have begun, this junior position has meant that Arizona's supply from the river is reduced first and most deeply. So while Phoenix does not depend as directly on Lake Mead as Las Vegas does, its junior position in the hierarchy of rights means that its share of the river's water is among the first to be slashed as the reservoir falls, placing it high on the list of cities that would lose their water first. The brutal math of the priority system puts Phoenix near the front of the line, not because of where it draws its water, but because of where it stands in the order of who gets cut. Now I know, this is the second time I am mentioning it, and if you already subscribed, you are a legend and you can ignore me completely. But if you are one of those people who has watched me count down 4 whole cities and still has not hit that button, I see you, and I am gently judging you. Hit subscribe. It is important, it is free, and future you, standing at a working tap, will thank you. Okay, no more interruptions. On to city number 5. Fifth on the list is Tucson, Arizona, another major Arizona city that depends significantly on the Colorado River water delivered through the same Great Canal project, and thus shares in the same junior priority and the same vulnerability. Tucson, as one of the largest cities in Arizona, receives a substantial portion of its water from the Colorado River system, and because that water comes through the junior priority project, it is exposed to the same early and deep cuts that threaten Phoenix. As the supply from the river is reduced, Tucson's share is among the first to be affected, placing it high on the list of vulnerable cities. Like Phoenix, Tucson faces the danger not because of a unique physical dependence on Lake Mead, but because of the junior position that its Colorado River water holds in the hierarchy of priority. Tucson's situation illustrates the way that the vulnerability of the Arizona cities is bound up with the junior priority of the state's Colorado River supply, a legacy of the bargain made to secure the Great Canal project. This junior position, which places Arizona's project water first in line for cuts, means that the major cities of central and southern Arizona that depend on this water are exposed to early and deep reductions as the crisis deepens. Tucson, drawing on this same junior priority supply, shares fully in this vulnerability, and its place on the list reflects the reality that the Arizona cities, because of the priority hierarchy, are among those that would lose their river water first, even though they are farther from Lake Mead than the Las Vegas region. Sixth on the list is Scottsdale, Arizona, a significant city in the Phoenix metropolitan area that likewise depends on the Colorado River water delivered through the Junior Priority Project. Scottsdale, as part of the greater Phoenix region, shares in the same reliance on the river water and the same vulnerability that comes from its junior position in the hierarchy of rights. As the supply is cut, Scottsdale's share of the river water is exposed to the same early reductions that threaten the other Arizona cities, placing it on the list of those that would lose their water first. Its inclusion reflects the broad exposure of the Phoenix metropolitan area to the crisis, the way that the junior priority of Arizona's river water threatens not just the city of Phoenix itself, but the many communities of the surrounding region that depend on the same supply. The presence of multiple Arizona cities on the list, Phoenix, Tucson, and Scottsdale among them, reflects the way that the state's junior priority exposes a large population to the danger of losing their river water early in the crisis. These are major cities, home to millions of people, and their dependence on the junior priority Colorado River supply means that they are collectively among the most vulnerable to the deepening shortage. As the crisis worsens and the cuts grow deeper, the Arizona cities face the prospect of losing more and more of their river water, and in the ultimate scenario of Lake Mead dying, they would be among those most severely affected, their junior position leaving them exposed to the deepest and earliest reductions. The Arizona cities, like the Las Vegas region, are near the front of the line to lose their water, though for a different reason, the harsh hierarchy of rights rather than sheer physical dependence. Seventh on the list is Mesa, Arizona, yet another major city of the Phoenix metropolitan area, sharing in the region's dependence on the junior priority Colorado River supply, and thus in its vulnerability. Mesa, as one of the larger cities in Arizona and a significant part of the greater Phoenix region, draws on the same river water threatened by the junior priority, and it faces the same exposure to early and deep cuts. Its place on the list reflects once again the broad vulnerability of the Phoenix metropolitan area, the way that the junior position of Arizona's river water threatens the entire region and the millions of people who live there. Mesa's inclusion underscores the scale of the population exposed to the danger, the many cities of central Arizona that depend on the same threatened supply. The concentration of Arizona cities in the middle of the list, following the Las Vegas region at the top, paints a clear picture of the geography of vulnerability. The cities most exposed to losing their water first are those of the Las Vegas region because of their near-total physical dependence on Lake Mead, followed by the cities of Arizona, because of the junior priority of their Colorado River supply. Together, these cities, spread across Nevada and Arizona, represent the population most immediately at risk from the death of Lake Mead, whether through direct dependence on the reservoir or through the harsh hierarchy of rights that places their water first in line for cuts. This is the front line of the crisis, the cities that would feel the loss of the water first and most severely, and it is dominated by the desert metropolises of Nevada and Arizona. Now we come to the cities of California, which occupy a different place on the list, lower than the cities of Nevada and Arizona, because of two crucial advantages that make them less immediately vulnerable, even though they too depend on the Colorado River. Understanding why the California cities rank lower is essential to understanding the whole hierarchy of vulnerability. The first advantage is that California holds a more senior priority in the hierarchy of rights, meaning that its share of the Colorado River water is protected when the cuts come, taken later than the junior water of Arizona and the vulnerable supply of Nevada. The second advantage is that the major California cities have alternative sources of water beyond the Colorado, drawing on other rivers and systems within the state so that they are not as completely dependent on the river as the desert cities of Nevada and Arizona. These two advantages, senior rights and diverse supply, place the California cities lower on the list, more insulated from the early effects of the crisis, though still exposed to the ultimate danger if Lake Mead dies entirely. Eighth on the list is Los Angeles, California, one of the largest cities in the country and a major recipient of Colorado River water, though one better protected than the cities above it. Los Angeles draws water from the Colorado River, delivered across the desert through a great aqueduct, and this water is an important part of its supply. But Los Angeles is not as vulnerable as the cities of Nevada and Arizona, for the two reasons that apply to the California cities generally. It benefits from California's senior priority, which protects its river water from the earliest cuts, and it draws on other sources of water beyond the Colorado, giving it alternatives to fall back on when the river supply is reduced. These advantages mean that Los Angeles would lose its river water later than the cities above it on the list, and would have more ability to absorb the loss, even though it remains, ultimately, exposed to the danger if the crisis deepens to the point where even the senior rights and the alternative sources are not enough. The place of Los Angeles on the list, lower than the cities of Nevada and Arizona, but still among the 10 most affected, reflects its partial but real dependence on the Colorado River. As a huge city with an enormous population, Los Angeles depends on the river water as a significant part of its supply, and the loss of that water would be a serious blow, forcing it to rely more heavily on its other sources and to intensify its conservation efforts. But because of its senior rights and its diverse supply, Los Angeles is better positioned to weather the crisis than the desert cities above it, and it would lose its river water later rather than first. Its inclusion on the list is a reminder that even the great coastal cities, with all their advantages, are not immune to the crisis of the Colorado, and that the death of Lake Mead would ultimately threaten even them. Ninth on the list is San Diego, California, another major California city that depends significantly on imported water, including water from the Colorado River. San Diego is notable for its heavy reliance on imported water, having historically depended greatly on water brought in from outside the region, including the Colorado River supply. This dependence on imported water is a source of vulnerability because a city that must import most of its water is exposed to any disruption in the sources it relies on. But San Diego, like Los Angeles, benefits from California's senior priority and has worked to diversify its supply and to develop alternative sources, including significant investments in other means of securing water. These efforts have reduced its vulnerability somewhat, placing it lower on the list than the cities of Nevada and Arizona, though its heavy reliance on imported water keeps it firmly among the 10 most affected. The situation of San Diego illustrates the vulnerability that comes from depending on imported water, even for a city with the advantages of senior rights and a coastal location. Because San Diego must bring in so much of its water from outside, it is exposed to the fate of the sources it depends on, including the Colorado River. And the death of Lake Mead would threaten an important part of its supply. But the city's investments in diversifying its supply and developing alternatives, combined with California's senior priority, mean that it is better protected than the desert cities above it, and would lose its river water later rather than first. San Diego's place on the list reflects this balance, a city significantly dependent on imported water, including the Colorado, but with advantages that place it lower in the hierarchy of vulnerability than the cities of Nevada and Arizona. 10th on the list are the cities of the Coachella Valley, California, the desert communities of Southern California that depend heavily on Colorado River water for their supply. This desert region, home to a number of communities, draws significantly on the Colorado River, delivered through canals that carry the water to the valley. And this dependence places the region among the 10 most affected by the death of Lake Mead. The Coachella Valley communities, situated in the desert and reliant on the imported river water, share in the vulnerability that comes from depending on the Colorado, though they benefit, like the other California users, from the state's senior priority. Their place at the bottom of the list reflects a real but somewhat more protected dependence on the river, exposure to the ultimate danger, balanced by the advantages that California's position provides. The inclusion of the Coachella Valley communities rounds out the list of 10, extending it to the desert regions of Southern California that depend on the Colorado River. These communities, like the other California users, would lose their river water later than the cities of Nevada and Arizona, protected somewhat by California's senior rights, but they remain among the 10 most affected because of their significant dependence on the imported river water. Their place on the list is a reminder that the reach of the Colorado extends across the entire region, from the desert cities of Nevada and Arizona to the coastal metropolises and the desert communities of California, and that the death of Lake Mead would ultimately threaten all of them, though in an order determined by the factors of dependence, priority, and infrastructure. So there is the list, the 10 cities that would lose their water first if Lake Mead dies, ranked by their vulnerability. At the top, the cities of the Las Vegas region, Las Vegas, Henderson, and North Las Vegas, most immediately exposed because of their near-total physical dependence on the reservoir. In the middle, the cities of Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson, Scottsdale, and Mesa, exposed because of the junior priority of their Colorado River supply, which places their water first in line for cuts. And at the bottom, the cities of California, Los Angeles, San Diego, and the Coachella Valley communities, exposed but better protected by California's senior rights and their diverse sources of supply, and thus losing their water later rather than first. This ranking tells the story of the crisis, the geography of vulnerability, the way that the death of Lake Mead would ripple across the region in an order determined by dependence, priority, and infrastructure. To fully grasp why the cities lose their water in this particular order, it helps to trace how the water physically reaches each of them, because the pathways of the water are the pathways of the vulnerability. The Las Vegas region draws its water directly from Lake Mead itself, through intakes that reach into the body of the reservoir, so that the city is tied to the actual level of the lake in the most literal and immediate way. There is no long canal, no distant aqueduct, just the intakes reaching into the water, and as the water falls, those intakes are directly threatened. This is why the Las Vegas region is so uniquely exposed, because its connection to Lake Mead is so direct, its straw dipped straight into the reservoir, its fate bound to the very surface level of the lake in a way that no other major population center shares. The Arizona cities, by contrast, receive their Colorado River water through a great canal project that lifts the water out of the river and carries it hundreds of miles across the desert to the cities of central and southern Arizona. This canal is an extraordinary feat of engineering, a river made by human hands, pumping the water uphill and across the arid land to reach the places that need it. But the water it carries holds a junior priority, a legacy of the bargain that made the canal possible, and this is the source of Arizona's vulnerability. The water reaches the Arizona cities through this canal, but it is the first to be cut when the shortage deepens, so that the Arizona cities, though physically farther from Lake Mead than Las Vegas, are exposed to early and deep reductions through the hierarchy of rights that governs the canal's water. The pathway of the water through the junior priority canal is the pathway of Arizona's exposure. The California cities receive their Colorado River water through their own great aqueducts, carrying the water across the desert to the coastal cities and the desert communities of Southern California. This water, too, travels a long way from the river to reach the cities that use it, but it holds a more senior priority, protected from the earliest cuts. And the California cities have other sources of water beyond the Colorado to fall back on. This combination of senior rights and alternative supply is why the California cities rank lower on the list, their pathway to the water more protected, their dependence on the Colorado partial rather than near total. The pathways of the water, then, tell the story of the ranking. The direct intakes of Las Vegas at the top, the junior priority canal of Arizona in the middle, and the senior diversified supply of California at the bottom. There is a crucial point to understand about the interconnection of the whole system, which is that the fate of these cities is not separate but bound together, all of them dependent on the same river and the same reservoirs, so that the crisis is a shared one even as its effects fall unevenly. Lake Mead does not exist in isolation, but is part of a larger system that includes the other great reservoir upstream and the whole network of dams and canals and agreements that govern the river. The health of the system as a whole determines the fate of all the cities. And the death of Lake Mead would be the culmination of a crisis affecting the entire system. This interconnection means that the vulnerability of the cities is a shared vulnerability, that they rise and fall together with the health of the river, even as the order in which they would lose their water reflects their individual circumstances. The crisis is a regional one, a threat to the whole interconnected system on which all the cities depend. It is also essential to understand that the cities are not the only users of the Colorado River water, and in fact, they are not even the largest, because the greatest share of the water goes not to the cities, but to agriculture, to the vast farms that depend on the river to grow their crops in the desert. This is a crucial part of the picture, because the competition for the shrinking water is not only among the cities, but between the cities and the farms. And the way that competition is resolved shapes the fate of everyone. The farms use the majority of the water, and any effort to protect the cities must reckon with the enormous agricultural demand, the difficult question of how to balance the water needs of the cities against those of the farms that feed the nation. The death of Lake Mead would force this competition to a head, compelling hard choices about who gets the dwindling water, the cities or the farms. And these choices would shape the survival of both. The competition between the cities and the farms adds a further layer of complexity to the crisis, because both have compelling claims to the water, and both would suffer grievously from its loss. The cities are home to the millions of people who depend on the water for their daily lives, and their loss of the water would be a humanitarian catastrophe. But the farms produce the food that feeds far more people beyond the region, and their loss of the water would threaten the food supply of the nation. Balancing these competing claims, deciding how to allocate the dwindling water between the cities and the farms, is one of the central dilemmas of the crisis, and it has no easy answer. The death of Lake Mead would sharpen this dilemma to its most acute, forcing the region to decide who must go without in order that others might survive, a choice of terrible difficulty. There is another dimension to the death of Lake Mead that compounds the crisis for the cities, and that is the loss of the electricity generated at the dam. The great dam that holds back Lake Mead is not only a barrier and a reservoir, but a power plant, generating a significant quantity of electricity from the force of the water passing through it, electricity that serves a large population across the region. As the reservoir falls, this power generation is threatened, and if the lake dies, the power would be lost entirely. This means that the death of Lake Mead would be not only a water crisis, but an energy crisis, striking the cities with the loss of both their water and a source of their electricity at the same time. The compounding of these crises, water and power failing together, would make the catastrophe even more severe, straining the cities in multiple ways at once and deepening the emergency that the death of the reservoir would bring. The economic stakes of the crisis are staggering because the cities on the list are not only home to millions of people, but are also major centers of economic activity. Engines of the regional and national economy. The great desert metropolises of Las Vegas and Phoenix, the coastal giants of Los Angeles and San Diego, the many communities in between, together represent an enormous concentration of economic activity, of jobs and industries and commerce, all of it dependent, ultimately, on the water. The death of Lake Mead would threaten this entire economic edifice, disrupting the industries and the commerce that depend on the water, throwing the regional economy into crisis and sending shockwaves through the national economy as well. The economic consequences of the water crisis would be immense, a further dimension of the catastrophe that the death of the reservoir would bring, and a reminder that the stakes extend far beyond the immediate loss of water to threaten the prosperity of the entire region. There is also the profound question of what would happen to the people themselves, to the millions who live in the cities on the list, if the water were truly to fail. A city cannot exist without water, and the loss of the water supply, if it could not be replaced, would ultimately threaten the very habitability of the affected cities, raising the specter of a population that could no longer be sustained where it lives. In the most severe scenarios, the failure of the water could force people to leave, to abandon the cities that could no longer support them, triggering a migration of a scale that is difficult to imagine. As the population of the desert Southwest confronted the reality that the water on which their cities were built could no longer sustain them. This is the ultimate stake of the crisis, the possibility that the death of Lake Mead could render the great desert cities unlivable, forcing a reckoning with the fundamental question of whether so many people can continue to live in a place so dependent on a resource that is running short. It is worth placing all of this in historical perspective, because the crisis of Lake Mead is the culmination of a long story. The the story of how the modern Southwest was built on the water of the Colorado and how that foundation has been undermined. When the Great Dam was built and Lake Mead was created, the reservoir filled with water, and for decades it stood high and full, a reassuring reserve that seemed to guarantee the water security of the region. On the strength of that security, the cities grew explosively, their populations swelling, their footprints spreading across the desert, all of it made possible by the water stored in the Great Reservoir. But the growth was built on an assumption of abundance that could not last. And as the demands grew and the river gave less, the reservoir began to fall, slowly at first and then more rapidly, until it reached the dangerous lows that now threaten the whole system. The death of Lake Mead, if it comes, would be the final chapter of this story, the moment when the foundation of the modern Southwest finally gave way. This historical perspective is important because it reveals that the crisis is not a sudden or unforeseeable event, but the predictable result of a long imbalance, the consequence of building a civilization on a foundation that was never truly secure. The warning signs have been visible for years, the reservoir falling, the crisis deepening, the danger growing. And yet the fundamental imbalance between the demands and the supply has not been resolved. The death of Lake Mead, in this light, is not an accident, but the logical endpoint of a trajectory that the region has been on for a long time, a trajectory that can still be changed, but only through a fundamental reckoning with the reality of the limits. The 10 cities on the list are, in a sense, living on borrowed time, sustained by a reservoir that is running dry, and their fate depends on whether the region can change course before the borrowed time runs out. Understanding the order in which the cities would lose their water is not merely an academic exercise, because that order has real consequences for how the crisis would unfold and how the region might respond. The cities that would lose their water first, the Las Vegas region and the Arizona cities, are the ones facing the most immediate danger. And their vulnerability makes the case for urgent action all the more compelling. But the fact that other cities, particularly in California, would lose their water later does not mean they are safe, because the death of Lake Mead would ultimately threaten them too, and the crisis that begins with the most vulnerable cities would spread, if unchecked, to threaten the entire region. The sequence of vulnerability is thus a warning to all the cities, a reminder that the crisis affecting the most exposed among them is a harbinger of the danger facing them all, and that the fate of the first cities to lose their water is bound up with the fate of them all. It is worth pausing to understand more deeply how the death of Lake Mead would actually unfold, because it would not be a single sudden event, but a progression, a series of escalating stages as the reservoir fell toward its ultimate demise. As the water level drops, the first effects are the cuts to the most vulnerable users, the reductions in supply that fall first on the junior priority water and the most exposed cities. These cuts deepen as the reservoir falls further, growing more severe, forcing the affected cities to reduce their water use, to draw on alternatives where they have them, and to endure ever tighter restrictions. As the level approaches the critical thresholds, the power generation at the dam is threatened, and the delivery of water becomes increasingly difficult, until, at the ultimate point of dead pool, the water can no longer be drawn and delivered at all. The death of Lake Mead is thus a process, a worsening crisis that unfolds over time, with the cities losing their water in the order determined by their vulnerability. The consequences of this unfolding crisis would be profound, reaching far beyond the immediate loss of water to threaten the entire fabric of life in the affected cities. Water is the foundation of everything in a modern city, the basis of health and sanitation, of the economy and the industry, of the daily life of the population. The loss of the water supply, or even severe restrictions on it, would disrupt every aspect of life, threatening public health, crippling the economy, and forcing drastic changes in how people live. The cities most affected would face a genuine crisis, a struggle to secure enough water to sustain their populations, to keep their economies functioning, to maintain the basic services that depend on water. This is the true stakes of the death of Lake Mead, not merely an inconvenience, but a threat to the viability of the cities that depend on the reservoir, a danger to the millions of people whose lives are built on the water it provides. The human dimension of this crisis is immense, because the cities on the list are home to millions of people, and the loss of their water would affect every one of them, These are not abstract entities, but communities of real people, families and workers and children, whose daily lives depend on the water flowing from their taps. The death of Lake Mead would touch all of them, forcing them to confront a scarcity that most have never imagined, to change how they live, and in the most severe scenarios, to face genuine hardship. The people of the Las Vegas region, of the Arizona cities, of the California communities, all of them are bound up with the fate of the reservoir, and the crisis that threatens it is ultimately a crisis that threatens them, their homes, their livelihoods, and their futures. There is also the question of what the affected cities can do, whether they are helpless in the face of the crisis or whether they have ways to protect themselves. The answer is that the cities are not helpless, that they have been working in various ways to reduce their vulnerability and to prepare for the possibility of severe cuts or even the death of the reservoir. The most fundamental response is conservation. The reduction of water use to stretch the available supply as far as possible, and many of the cities on the list have made significant strides in using their water more efficiently. Beyond conservation, the cities have pursued alternative sources of water, developing new supplies to reduce their dependence on the Colorado, investing in recycling and reuse, and in some cases in other means of securing water. These efforts can reduce the vulnerability of the cities, buying them time and giving them alternatives, though they cannot fully replace the water that the Colorado provides. The cities most dependent on Lake Mead, particularly the Las Vegas region, have been especially aggressive in these efforts, precisely because they understand their extreme vulnerability. Las Vegas, for instance, has become a model of water conservation, dramatically reducing its per-person water use, recycling much of its water, and taking extraordinary measures to protect its access to the reservoir. These efforts have allowed the region to continue growing even as its water situation has grown more precarious. And they represent a serious attempt to manage the vulnerability that comes from depending so heavily on Lake Mead. But even the most aggressive conservation and the most determined pursuit of alternatives cannot fully insulate a city from the death of the reservoir on which it depends, and so the vulnerability remains, mitigated but not eliminated. The broader response to the crisis, beyond the efforts of the individual cities, involves the whole region working to address the fundamental imbalance between the demands on the Colorado River and the water it can provide. Because the crisis stems from the region taking more water than the river delivers, the ultimate solution requires reducing the demands, bringing them into line with the diminished supply so that the reservoirs can stabilize and the death of Lake Mead can be prevented. This requires the difficult work of reducing water use across the region, of reforming the agreements that govern the river, and of sharing the sacrifice among the many users. It is a challenge of enormous difficulty, bound up with the competing interests and the entrenched rights and the reluctance of the users to accept cuts, but it is the only real way to prevent the ultimate catastrophe. The fate of the 10 cities on the list, and of the millions of people who depend on them, hangs on whether the region can meet this challenge. It is important to emphasize that the death of Lake Mead is not inevitable, that it is a scenario to be understood and prevented rather than a certainty to be accepted. The reservoir has fallen to dangerous lows, and the crisis is real and serious, but there is still time to act, to reduce the demands and stabilize the system before the ultimate point is reached. The scenario of Lake Mead dying and of the 10 cities losing their water is a warning, a look at what could happen if the crisis is not addressed, and its purpose is to spur the action that would prevent it. The cities on the list are vulnerable, but their fate is not sealed, and the choices that the region makes in the coming years will determine whether the scenario becomes reality or remains a warning that prompted the region to change course. The story of the 10 cities and the death of Lake Mead is, in the end, a story about the consequences of building a civilization in the desert on the foundation of a single overtaxed river, and about the vulnerability that comes from depending so completely on a resource that is running short. The cities of the Southwest grew and prospered on the water of the Colorado, building great metropolises and places that could never have supported them without the imported water, and in doing so, they bound their fate to the fate of the river and its reservoirs. Now, as the crisis of the Colorado deepens and Lake Mead falls toward its dangerous thresholds, that vulnerability is being exposed, and the question of which cities would lose their water first has become a matter of genuine and pressing importance. The ranking of the 10 cities is a map of that vulnerability, a guide to who is most at risk, and a reminder of the stakes of the crisis. There is a sobering lesson to be drawn from the fate of other bodies of water around the world that have died. Because the death of a great lake is not without precedent, and the examples that exist are a warning of what could happen to the Southwest. Around the world, there have been cases of large lakes and inland seas that shrank and died as the water that sustained them was diverted or dried up, leaving behind exposed beds, ruined ecosystems, and devastated communities. These examples demonstrate that the death of a great body of water is a real possibility, not a mere hypothetical, and that the consequences can be severe and lasting. The Southwest, in contemplating the possible death of Lake Mead, would do well to heed these warnings, to recognize that the great reservoir is not immune to the fate that has befallen other bodies of water, and that the crisis it faces is part of a broader pattern of the consequences of overusing the water on which human societies depend. The comparison to these other cases underscores the importance of acting to prevent the death of Lake Mead. The lakes and seas that have died did not do so overnight, but through a long process of decline, driven by the diversion of the water that sustained them, much like the one now threatening Lake Mead. In each case, the warning signs were present, the decline was visible, and yet the problem of overuse was not addressed in time. The Southwest has the opportunity to learn from these examples, to recognize the trajectory it is on, and to change course before it is too late, but only if it takes the warnings seriously and acts with the urgency that the crisis demands. The death of Lake Mead is preventable, but preventing it requires learning the lesson that other regions learned too late. The lesson that a great body of water can indeed die if the demands upon it are not brought into balance with what it can provide. For the people who live in the cities on the list, there is a natural question of what they can do as individuals, how they can protect themselves and contribute to the solution in the face of a crisis so vast and so systemic. The most direct thing that individuals can do is to conserve water, to reduce their own use, because the aggregate effect of millions of people using less water can make a real difference to the demand on the system. Simple measures, from reducing outdoor watering to fixing leaks to adopting more efficient appliances and habits, can collectively reduce the strain on the water supply and help to extend the life of the reservoir. Beyond individual conservation, people can support the broader efforts to address the crisis, the policies and the investments and the agreements that are needed to bring the demands into balance with the supply, and can stay informed and engaged with an issue that affects their lives so directly. While the crisis is ultimately a systemic one that requires action at the level of the whole region, the choices of individuals do matter, both in their direct effect on the demand and in their contribution to the collective will to address the problem. There is also the matter of preparedness, of individuals and communities taking steps to be ready for the possibility of severe water restrictions, so that they are not caught unprepared if the crisis deepens. This preparedness includes understanding where one's water comes from and how vulnerable it is, being aware of the plans the local water authorities have for managing shortages, and being ready to adapt to the restrictions a worsening crisis would bring. While it is to be hoped that the ultimate catastrophe of the death of Lake Mead can be prevented, the reality is that the crisis is already forcing restrictions and reductions, and the people of the affected cities would do well to be prepared for the possibility that these could grow more severe. Preparedness does not replace the need for systemic action, but it can help individuals and communities weather the crisis and adapt to the changing reality of water in the Southwest. As we come to the end of this countdown, it is worth reflecting on what the list really tells us, which is that the death of Lake Mead would not be an abstract or distant event, but a catastrophe that would touch the lives of millions of people across the Southwest, in an order determined by the harsh realities of dependence, priority, and infrastructure. The cities of the Las Vegas region, most dependent on the reservoir, would feel the loss first. The cities of Arizona, exposed by their junior priority, would follow. And the cities of California, better protected by their senior rights and their diverse sources, would lose their water later, though they too would ultimately be threatened. This is the geography of the crisis, the way that the death of a single reservoir in the desert would ripple across an entire region, threatening the water security of one of the fastest-growing parts of the country. The falling of Lake Mead is a warning written in the bleached rock of a desert canyon, a sign of a crisis that threatens the foundation of life in the Southwest, and the ranking of the 10 cities that would lose their water first is a way of understanding just how serious that crisis has become. These cities, home to millions, are on the front line of a slow-moving disaster. Their water security tied to the fate of a shrinking reservoir, their futures dependent on whether the region can find a way to bring its demands into balance with what the river can provide. The death of Lake Mead is not inevitable, but the vulnerability is real, and the 10 cities on this list are the ones that would pay the price first if the great reservoir were ever to die. Understanding their situation and the crisis that threatens them is the first step toward preventing the catastrophe, toward finding a way to keep the water flowing and the cities alive, before the day comes when the taps run dry and the scenario we have explored becomes a terrible reality. It is worth emphasizing, too, that the ranking of these 10 cities is not fixed for all time, because the vulnerability of each city can change as circumstances change, as cities invest in new sources of water, as agreements are renegotiated, and as the crisis itself evolves. A city that is highly vulnerable today may reduce its vulnerability through determined effort, through conservation and the development of alternative supplies, while a city that seems more protected may find its advantages eroded as the crisis deepens. The ranking, then, is a snapshot of the present vulnerability, a reflection of the circumstances as they now stand, and it can shift as the region responds to the crisis and as the situation continues to develop. This fluidity is a reason for hope as well as concern, because it means the cities are not passive victims, but can act to change their fate, to reduce their vulnerability. The order in which the cities would lose their water is a product of choices as much as of geography, and different choices could produce a different outcome. The most important message of this countdown is that the crisis is real and serious and demands action, but that it is not yet a foregone conclusion. Lake Mead has fallen to dangerous lows. The cities that depend on it are genuinely vulnerable, and the scenario of the reservoir dying and the cities losing their water is a real possibility. But the future is not yet written, and the choices that the region makes in the coming years will determine whether the scenario becomes reality. The purpose of understanding the crisis, of ranking the vulnerable cities and grasping the stakes, is not to spread despair, but to spur the action that could prevent the catastrophe, to make clear what is at risk and why it matters, so that the region can summon the will to save the system before it is too late. In the final accounting, the fate of these 10 cities is bound together. All of them dependent, in one way or another, on the water of the Colorado River stored in Lake Mead, all of them exposed to the danger of the reservoir's death, all of them ranked in an order that reflects the depth of their vulnerability. From Las Vegas, most exposed of all, to the communities of the Coachella Valley, more protected but still at risk. These cities represent the population most immediately threatened by the crisis of the Colorado, and their story is a warning to the entire region and beyond. The water that built the modern Southwest is running short. The great reservoir that stores it is falling, and the cities that depend on it are counting, whether they know it or not, on the region